We're going to reconvene this afternoon's meeting, this panel 2, which is applied resilience measurement. As you know, this morning we spent a good bit of time discussing more of a theoretical approach to resilience, which I thought that was a wonderful dialogue that led into a lot of the applicable side of resilience. And I think this afternoon you're going to see a bit of a deeper dive in this conversation. I do want to remind all of our online viewers who I hope are coming back online with us. We're running a little late, and I apologize for that. But again, to submit your comments or questions with the hashtag BIFAD. But I'd like to move forward for the interest of time and introduce the moderator for this afternoon's panel. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tiffany Griffin. Dr. Griffin. Do we have Dr. Griffin? I hope Dr. Griffin. Here we go. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Dr. Griffin is from the USAID Center for Resilience. She's also and lead for strategic analytics and M&E. And again, she will be moderating this afternoon's panel on applied resilience measurement. Dr. Griffin, please join me.
Thank you, and I'd like to ask my panel to approach the podium, please. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiffany Griffin, and I work in the Center for Resilience at USAID. I lead up the M&E and strategic analytics work for the center. Really excited to talk to you this afternoon about resilience measurement. This panel will be applying many of the resilience theories and measurement principles that you heard about in the first panel in an application context. So in that first panel, there were some broad theories discussed, but I want to, before turning it over to the panel and using the bulk of the session for their presentation of evidence, I did want to kind of extract some of the key resilience measurement principles from those broader theories that were discussed earlier. So just to reiterate the definition, a brief definition, resilience is basically successfully managing shocks and stresses without compromising well-being. And although seemingly simple and straightforward in the measurement community around resilience, and the sirens, we've really deemed it important to capture that concept in a way that deviates from traditional monitoring and evaluation approaches. And some of those deviations are because this construct of resilience isn't an outcome in and of itself. You're not striving to strengthen resilience for strengthening resilience's sake. You're striving to strengthen resilience because we believe and now have evidence that shows when you do so, you protect well-being or development outcomes. So those are the agricultural outcomes, food security outcomes, hunger, economic well-being. That's protected in the face of shocks and stresses. Many of the shocks and stresses that the communities we work with face aren't going anywhere, and in fact, they're increasing in frequency and severity. And so equipping these communities with resources and strategies to manage those, given the fact that many of them, unfortunately, are inevitable, behooves us in terms of protecting our well-being and development gains. So some of those resilience measurement principles, hence, one, that resilience cannot be captured through a single indicator. And so in that first panel, you heard about some different ways of capturing resilience, but you'll notice that none of them said, here is the resilience indicator, right? And we'll hear a little bit more about that from the panel. It ought to be captured through both objective measures and subjective measures, right? There are certain conditions that happen on the ground that you want to capture objectively. And in addition to that, you also want to capture individuals, households, communities' lived experiences of those conditions on the ground, and so you need subjective indicators and objective indicators. It's not enough to just track well-being over time, right? It's not enough to just look at whether our development outcomes are going up or going down over time. You have to look at this interrelationship between shocks and how shocks are experienced. Capacities are those strategies that help households and communities manage shocks, and well-being. It's that interrelationship between the three that allows you to truly capture whether you're actually enhancing resilience over time. Another kind of key measurement principle that came out of that first panel is that there's a difference between resilience and resilience capacity, right? So the ability to withstand shocks and stresses is different than the sources that help you enhance that ability. And we'll hear a lot more about that. And then finally, there's a dynamic nature to the measurement of resilience. So with that, I will turn it over to this panel. Again, they're highlighting the evidence that's generated when you apply those resilience measurement principles to the programming on the ground that's designed to enhance resilience. I've asked each panelist to highlight one finding and then to tie that finding to core resilience measurement principles that enable them to capture that evidence. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim Frankenberger of Tango International. And then if I could just ask each panelist to introduce themselves as they come up, I thought that would save a little bit of time. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Tim Frankenberger. I'm the president of Tango International. We've been engaged in resilience measurement actually since 2006 for some of our early work in Ethiopia, but more so in the last 5 to 6 years. We have been privileged to participate in many of the Feed the Future impact evaluations that are being carried out in Ethiopia, Kenya, and West Africa. We also are carrying out studies in places like Zimbabwe, Bangladesh, and a number of other countries. So one of the things that we've been working on that Jen Cisse actually mentioned this morning is that we've been focusing on these recurrent monitoring surveys and as one of the ways that we're trying to capture the dynamic nature of how resilience evolves over time as people are experiencing these shocks and stresses. So, I can click it, huh? So as Tiffany just said, what we're really interested in is seeing how a set of capacities that people have access to, these are things like savings, these are things like having access to credit, access to different livelihood strategies, having the right policies in place, having changes in cultural norms so that women are more empowered to do things, the transformative capacities. We're interested in how people use these different capacities to manage a particular shock or set of shocks that they're exposed to try to maintain some well-being outcome indicator or to actually recover quickly if things got so bad that that outcome indicator got worse. And so one way that we found that was really helpful to do this was, well, first of all, I don't need to say this again because Tiffany already pointed out the difference between resilience and resilience capacities, why we are tracking the stability of these well-being outcome indicators over time or how quickly we recover to a particular point and how these capacities actually influence that is really important for you to understand the difference between those two things. This recurrent monitoring system that I'm talking about has been set up in Ethiopia. What we've been looking at is we have a baseline that was carried out in 2013 where we had 3,100 households that we were surveying, and then we did a panel data set, a subset of that baseline that we were tracking over time as a particular shock hit. And in the low areas of Ethiopia, you don't have to wait very long before a major drought hit, and over the last 5 years, we've seen multiple droughts hit these areas. And so we've let certain trigger indicators, these are both satellite imagery type indicators, but also FuseNet and local early warning systems that are being implemented in these areas, tell us and convince us that things really were bad enough that we needed to actually go in and start looking to see how people were coping with that shock. Now, we want to measure this over time, so we're tracking the kinds of decisions that households are making every 2 months as they're responding to these shocks. And what was also said in the panel this morning is that a drought shock leads to all kinds of downstream effects. So a drought shock can lead to livestock disease. Livestock disease forces everybody to try to sell their animals off before they die. People are flooding the market with their animals. That causes a market shock because the terms of trade turn against people trying to sell their animals. But because it's a drought, the food in the areas also starts to go up in price because they have to bring the food in from outside. So that market shock then creates people to turn to other kinds of things like moving their animals into other people's lands, creating a conflict shock. So we see a 20% increase in the conflict going up. So these downstream effects are important to track. They don't happen all at the same time. And so one of the reasons why we're measuring this stuff over the whole year is that we're watching this play out over that whole year. And the decisions that you make in one season have an effect on the decisions you make later. So what we also found is that certain strategies that people turn to cope with the initial shock no longer are available to them by the time they're facing the third set of shocks. Okay, so they've used up their social capital, they can't use that anymore. Now they're having to turn to other negative coping strategies like pulling their kids out of school, or getting into debt, or cutting down on the foods that they're consuming. So then they use other strategies to try to deal with that. And so what we're trying to understand is, how do these strategies evolve over time as these different shocks evolve over time, so that we can really track to see if people are resilient or not. And the other thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to see if the projects that people are actually implementing in those areas are affecting their ability to manage those shocks better. And so there was a project, this PRIME project, that was a Feed the Future project, very much focused on resilience building. We wanted to see, was it really making a difference in allowing people to manage these shocks? Now, unfortunately, that was also said by Beth, we had one of the worst drought events ever in the last 50 years that hit this area that we were actually studying. So if these people were resilient to these large covariant shocks, we would find out in this study. Okay. The other thing that Marco mentioned, which I think is important, is that we were combining both quantitative and qualitative approaches here. And I can't emphasize, I'm an anthropologist by training, so I can't emphasize it enough how important this qualitative work is in helping us interpret the quantitative data. Now, we also have a number of economists that we work together, and I'm actually also trained in economics, so that's the only reason I am is so I can fight with my wife, who's an ag economist. But the point is that you need both of these types of measures. So what we found was it's really important to be tracking these things over time. That you need to be able to see how people's food security is changing, how that they are actually managing those shocks effectively. Are they stabilizing their access to food? Are they stabilizing their ability not to have to sell off all their assets? And what factors are allowing them to do that? Now, one of the things that we found, and this is this one finding that Tiffany asked me to present, is that where we found more interventions taking place, more high-intensity types of interventions, we found that it made a huge difference in the people's ability to manage these shocks and stresses. That as the severity of the shock got worse, people were able to maintain their food security over time. Whereas those households that were in low-intensity areas, in other words, there were very few project interventions going on, they actually got worse by 30%. So this was a pretty good example of how these kinds of interventions that were being implemented by the program really made a difference. Now, what are the program implications? That's the other thing that Tiffany asked us to talk about. Well, one of the things that's really important is that you can't just get one intervention that's going to make the difference. You have to have a comprehensive approach. You need to layer and sequence these interventions so that you're having an impact. As I said before, people might use up one strategy in the beginning, and then if they only have one strategy, you only have one trick pony, you're not going to be able to solve the problem 6 months down the road when you're actually still experiencing these other shocks. The other thing that's important is that these interventions really made a difference in terms of being able to sell off livestock so that you didn't lose them through disease and early enough so that you don't have all these unplanned deaths of your animals making it worse off for you. So the project was very good at helping them market animals in the right time with the information that this shock was only going to get worse over time. Access to financial services also made a big difference in this place, because what happened was people could diversify into other income sources. They could actually use those resources to get out of just climate risk type interventions or climate risk livelihood systems and move towards systems that weren't as exposed to those climate risks. Social capital was also a very critical piece here, and I think Greg was talking about this before. If you have connections to people that are living outside of this area that's hit by the drought and can rely on them for remittances, not just, these are remittances not only coming from maybe Addis, but also from Minnesota that are coming back into this area. These are important to help people manage this stuff. We also found that having good trigger indicators also is key to knowing when to have your cash or food assistance that may be needed for an emergency response to be timely. So one of the biggest factors that was actually a problem here was when the informal safety nets were working really well as long as the clan leaders stayed in place and were allowing for the redistribution of resources. But once the clan leader left, because his animals were dying, he had to move it to different pasture, different water, that's when the informal system broke down. And when the informal system broke down, that's when the widows, the small children, the orphans, the elder people in these villages became much worse off. And you saw malnutrition rates starting to spike. 28% of the population in these villages had at least one kid in a clinic because of this problem. So the point is that you can use this information to actually identify what seems to be working and where you should be putting more investments. Thank you.
Get to the next presentation. Oh, you're doing it. Okay. Marco?
It's me. Good afternoon. I don't think I need to introduce myself. I did it 15, 20, no, 1 hour ago. But I'm not part of Columbia University.
No.
I can present on behalf. I presented on behalf of Luca, then you do my job, okay?
No.
So, my name is Marco Del Rico, I work for RFAO, and I still have the same problem with the absence of lens. So what we are going to show, here we go, perfect. Here it is, are some just basic example of what we do as applications of RIMA. We've been already discussing about how RIMA works. It's just very briefly to refresh. It's a direct and indirect measure of resilience. We measure resilience through latent variable model and regression analysis. We try to integrate qualitative and quantitative measure approaches for collecting data, and we normally use also pre-existing or ad hoc collected data. So some of the examples are related to the type of shocks that we are using. In this case, we use two types of shocks, as Tim was mentioning. So there are the covariates and idiosyncratic shock. When we talk about the idiosyncratic shock, we are talking about shocks which are just referring to single households. So let's say, imagine the death of the main source of income, or maybe if I die, for example, my family may be in troubles. And covariate shocks, for example, is shocks like related to climate, to conflict, as Greg was also mentioning this morning, to markets. For this, we tend to use secondary sources data. For example, in the conflict, there are a number of interesting data sets available on the web, like ACLED, like PRIO, and other type of data sets. In terms of climatic shock, we've been using a lot of different existing indicators, like NDMI or other agricultural stress index and other information coming from GIS. And for market shocks, we tend to use this very high frequency data collected by WFP or other existing organization in the field, operating in the field. Yeah, I thought I removed this one. No. So this is a first example, is in Uganda. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I think this is not exactly the latest version of my presentation, but it's fine. Okay, in any case. So in Uganda in 2016, we set up this resilience measurement unit, and we organized data collection in Karamoja. Karamoja is a region which is bordering with Turkana in Kenya. So basically there is Karamoja and Turkana divided by a mountain, and there are a number of big problems in terms of water, because the largest part of the population is based on pastoralism, and the water finishes earlier in Turkana, so many people from Turkana moves to Karamoja. This is going to create a number of social tensions. So we did this analysis in order to obtain BIFAD, and it's fine. But the analysis was good in Karamoja. Yeah, exactly. So the analysis was fine in Karamoja. It was very interesting, showing the tensions, the social problems between the Turkana and the Karamojan. Okay, thanks. I can handle this now. Okay, whatever. Perfect. Thanks very much. Okay. So in this type of analysis, we were showing the impact of shocks on resilience. Another interesting analysis that we do was to measure the impact of conflicts on resilience capacity. So in this case, for example, we were using a data set that was reporting the effect of conflicts between Israeli and Palestinian, checking how this is going to affect the capacity, the resilience capacity of Palestinians in terms of meeting their food security requirements. And the interesting aspect is that when we go to this type of analysis, we manage to unpack the effect on resilience. In this case, for example, we managed to understand that the biggest driver of this reduction of resilience was driven by a reduction in adaptive capacity and the deterioration of income stability and the reduction of income diversification sources. So these are going to provide specific indications to policymakers in order to support adequately the situation. Another very interesting exercise that I would like to discuss, that we were discussing about 2 minutes, but I've been interrupted a number of times. This is a very interesting exercise, trying to pull together subjective and objective measure. Basically, this is something we are developing together with London School of Economics and ODI. We developed a tool for detecting the resilience capacity, a subjective resilience capacity perception. So basically, we try to understand how households perceive themselves. And the results led by our quantitative analysis and the results from the subjective analysis were going in two different directions, showing something very interesting. In this example, this is a study run, the study run in Karamoja that we were mentioning before. Those who received a shock in the last 12 months had this shock having a negative effect on the resilience indicator. So basically, we're saying that the resilience level of this household is deteriorated in terms of their practical assets, in terms of their livestock, land, or different channels, because as a result of this shock. But on the subjective measure, those who received the shock, they perceived themselves as more resilient than the other people. The reason why this was happening is because if you think about it, the first time that you receive a shock, our type of shock, very much normal shocks, and you manage to survive the shock, you think that yourself is more capable of dealing with the shock. No? So basically what was happening is that this subjective measure of resilience is bringing another piece of the information that we don't capture with the quantitative approach. So this is very informative for understanding how we need to include both of them in the moment where we try to do a proper analysis of resilience capacity. And another interesting, this is my last slide, another interesting example that I'm showing here is the effect of social protection. In this case, it's a cash transfer project organized by the national government of Lesotho. It was covering nearly the whole country, and we are checking the effect on the resilience indicator that we use on RIMA, and we managed to understand that there is a positive effect on resilience, on household resilience, and especially the results have been led by the increase of different assets and the access to many assets because of the result, as a result of this little injection of money on a monthly basis. Of course, when we do this type of analysis, and this takes me back to what we were saying before with Jean, is the fact that the largest part of the variables that we do include, not the largest part, but there are some variables that we do include in resilience estimation which are very time sensitive. If you think, for example, to education, which may have eventually even a negative effect on the short period, it has for sure a positive effect on the long period, because if you send your kids to school, you will definitely have a positive effect on your resilience in the long period. But in the short period, there may be some controversial effect. This is very hard to integrate in a proper resilience analysis and in the impact of this analysis. I think that's it, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, Lynn. Thank you. Now, Lynn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and am Lynn Michalopoulos. I'm from Columbia University, and I am probably very different from most of you in the room because I'm a trained social worker. I do a lot of global mental health work. And so I'm going to talk today about psychosocial factors in the context of trauma and the resilience framework, and highlight an example of the development, adaptation, and validation of a scale to measure psychosocial factors in Uganda. Let's see. And I'm having the same issue as Marco, that I forgot my glasses at home, so I hit 40x, and all of a sudden I couldn't see past. So I wanted to start out this presentation by just throwing out the question of who cares, so what? So why should we think about psychosocial factors, especially in the context of trauma, in and of themselves, and also in relation to resilience? Well, psychosocial factors, especially as trauma outcomes, really can have a burden on families, communities. Research has shown can increase HIV risk, can decrease community social capital, and can be really a threat to human rights and social justice. When I'm talking about psychosocial factors, I'm talking about thoughts, feelings, behaviors, aspirations, interpersonal relationships, worldview. So it's a very broad definition. But it can really impact individuals, households, communities, systems, countries, and it also is very related to food security, so what we've been talking about today. So there's been a lot of research and a lot of evidence to show that mental health problems or psychosocial problems are related to food insecurity. In terms of resilience and resilience capacities, psychosocial factors really, again, matter in and of themselves, but really can get in the way of resilience capacities. So if we think about the different types of resilience capacities, absorptive, so managing risk in the midst of a shock, can really get at in terms of appropriate use of coping strategies. So if you think of widespread substance use in the face of a shock or trauma, adaptive resilience, so the proactive adjustment for managing a shock. If individuals have symptoms of depression, lack self-efficacy, this can decrease one's confidence in their ability to adapt. And even at the transformative resilience capacity level, looking at cultural norms and ways of thinking. So if you think about gender-based violence, this can differentially impact women and girls in terms of the transformative resilience capacity, and can also drive vulnerable pathways in terms of resilience. So, thinking about hanging in, so decreasing self-efficacy, also, again, thinking about substance use and more individuals dropping out of livelihoods. So really is very connected. So one of the issues with psychosocial factors, and we've talked, some of the panelists have talked about some of this already, but it's really looking at subjective factors. So there is usefulness, and hopefully you've gotten a sense that it's really important to account for, but how do we actually do this? And so there are challenges in obtaining subjective data in terms of psychosocial factors, but it can be done both quantitatively and qualitatively. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I've been involved with colleagues of mine from Johns Hopkins University, the Applied Mental Health Research Group, in developing a global post-trauma symptom scale. It's more of an item bank, and how we've adapted it in multiple contexts. This project was motivated, some of the reasons that I've already hit on, but it was motivated by a number of reasons. First of all is looking at the appropriateness of instruments that are currently out there in the face of trauma. So most instruments that are used in global mental health have been based on Western conceptualizations of mental health. So we think of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a construct that was developed based on Vietnam vets' experience. And so we started to think like, well, can this really be applied for women that have experienced sexual violence in the Congo? Also looking at some of the discrepancies in epidemiological data that's available. There was a large systematic review that was done by Steele and colleagues in 2009 that looked at a number of different trauma-affected populations from low and middle income countries and found the prevalence rate of post-traumatic stress disorder ranging from 0% to 99%, which one can't get more variability than that. The other thing that motivated this project is that looking at the global mental health field, there's a huge debate, and there are two sides. So on one side, there's a universalist who says, you know, a shock is a shock, trauma is trauma, we're all humans, we're all going to respond in the same way. Then there's the other side, which comes more out of the anthropological view of the constructivist that says, no, you have to rely on what the context is and look at those local idioms of distress. My colleagues and I are somewhere in the middle. We don't want to throw out what's already been established and what may be useful, but you have to account for the context. We also wanted to develop appropriate and free instruments that could be applied in multiple settings. So in terms of the project, we took a number of different steps, which I'm not going to go in great detail, but the first step was to do a large systematic review of all qualitative studies in the literature that were related to psychosocial problems related to trauma. Then we conducted, using a multi-country data set, looking at trauma-affected populations, looked at using item response theory analysis to look at specific PTSD symptoms and looked at which ones actually perform the best across different contexts, then drafted an item bank based on these results, consulted with global mental health experts, and then piloted and are validating it now currently in a number of different contexts. So what we're interested in is really getting at, are there a core set of universal signs and symptoms, and then being able to then go back and refine it based on different regions. So this is our item bank, and obviously we've talked about, and I don't know if it was, I think Greg mentioned earlier that, you know, you asked, if you're asked for a way of measuring something by just a number of different indicators, you're obviously not going to send them this, because this is, you know, a 72 item bank. But what we're able to do is use this as a starting point to adapt and validate in different contexts. So we did this in Uganda, starting out with a qualitative method of doing cognitive interviews. So really trying to assess from individuals, are we getting at with these items, because it's psychosocial factors, something subjective, are we getting at what we're intending to get at? So asking them these items, say, tell me back in your own words what this item means to you. And we were able to do this with 30 individuals from the Rakai and Masaka region. And just to note that 88% of our sample had experienced 5 or more traumatic lifetime events. And then we validated the study. And then for the sake of time, I won't go through all of the ways that we were able to validate the study. But the main point that I want to drive home is that we're able to establish both validity and reliability of the final scale. And by using item response theory analysis, we're able to reduce the scale to 11 items. So from 50-something, from an item bank down to 11 items. That can now be used in this context. And the best finding is that we were able to establish incremental validity. So we were able to, our scale of 11 items actually predicted functioning better than a standard PTSD scale. So really showing that it's actually very culturally relevant. Our next steps is we'd like to be able to integrate this within the resilience framework, be able to look at how it's related to the different resilience capacities, And in terms of the take-home messages, psychosocial factors really do matter in relation to the response of shocks and stressors. They must be accounted for, and they actually can be measured. They're associated with all the resilience capacities, and the context really does matter. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lynn. And now John Kurtz from Mercy Corps.
Super, thanks. I think I'm going to sit down if everybody can hear me this way. Great. Good. Cheers. One thing, observation first. I realize how Tiffany picked us all on the panel here. It's only men with facial hair. So for you gentlemen aspiring to be panelists, don't worry about publishing. Just keep the razor aside. I think that's it. So similar to Lynn, I want to focus in on a specific topic around resilience. And today I wanted to talk about resilience in the context of conflict shocks. And I think it's relevant because the recent World Development Report estimated that 80% of humanitarian needs are driven by conflict at the moment. So that puts it into pretty stark relief that not just humanitarian organizations, but more of the development enterprise generally increasingly is required to focus on these areas. But from a measurement perspective, from our own research and experience, it has a few big implications for how we go about understanding resilience in the context of conflict. And I'll talk through three. The first is that we really need to debunk this idea of thinking about resilience to the effects of conflict only. The second is to really rethink some of our hypotheses that are quite different in these contexts compared to other shocks. And the third that I'll talk about is thinking about a different approach to measuring conflict as a shock and how we treat that in our analysis. So to start, I think all of us can understand why we would want to turn the measurement enterprise on its head, right? I think we can agree that it's pretty unethical to think about trying to just build resilience to help people cope with conflict. I mean, if we're thinking Syria, anywhere else, we recognize that there's drivers of conflict that are out of our control, but at the same time, it's not sufficient for us just to help mitigate those on people's welfare. So that means that we have the difficult task of trying to see if we can reduce conflict or at least people's exposure to it. And that brings with it the challenge of trying to understand if we've helped people avert risks or trying to measure something that is essentially the absence of a shock. So here we've got a couple of examples where we think there's some promising practice that we can draw on, and it's largely from the peace-building field as well as the disaster risk reduction field. The first example is work we did years ago in Ethiopia, and it was essentially a pretty crude comparison group design where we actually had a peace-building programming working on natural resource management governance in the lead up to the 2011 drought, and we were able to attribute change in peace and conflict outcomes to some of our interventions. So, reduced incidence of conflict, higher perceptions of ability to move securely, et cetera. And then importantly, what came along with that was results that showed those changes to security also had knock-on effects on, in this case, pastoralists' ability to be able to maintain assets and welfare, food consumption during the drought. And the logic there is pretty straightforward, but I think looking at those two together is the kind of frame we want to have around understanding conflict and resilience. The second set of approaches are a little bit more nascent, but we and others have done work in our case in Iraq, trying to predict incidents of conflict, future incidents. And through a series of national polls in Iraq over the last 5 years, we had enough data to be able to use machine learning techniques to be able to get pretty accurate estimates of when and where conflict would occur. There's been others, Chris Blattman and others in Liberia that have done this with, I think, up to 88% accuracy. So it strikes me as a pretty good basis for us to being able to say, okay, we have a strong sense of when and where, again, conflict may break out. We can then start to look at if and how programs and policies are reducing that chance. Probably not perfect, but again, I think, quite a bit there to go on. So definitely ways of trying to capture the absence of a shock and conflict in particular. That said, especially in these state-sponsored contexts of violence like Syria, there is still going to be a need for us to work on how, reducing the impact. And so this is to the second implication where when we're looking at that side of the equation, from our own results from a number of studies, we really do get consistently surprised and kind of confounded by what we would assume would be supportive factors of resilience to conflict. In analysis in Syria, we looked at sources of livelihood adaptation and welfare recovery in terms of consumption and shelter. And there, some of the usual suspects actually did come out. So things like access to markets and financial services, women's decision-making in households, social connectedness. But then we've looked elsewhere and even more rigorously at this and been, again, surprised. So in Afghanistan, for example, we did some reanalysis of impact evaluation data from the National Solidarity Program. So this is a big World Bank community-driven development intervention across 3,000 some odd villages. And there we were trying to look at, okay, for the subset of those villages where conflict continued to be an issue, do we see resilience outcomes in the sense of ability to maintain or regain food consumption? And if so, can that be attributed to what we saw the NSP do, which was building resilience capacities around, again, women's inclusion, local government performance, and what we called linking social capital, so connections between villages and local leaders. In this case, none of those things were either sufficient enough or the right things to be able to contribute to resilience in the form that we normally measure it. So it's one that's just making us step back and think, even where we have robust evidence of impact on resilience capacities in the face of conflict, it's not always a given that these are going to then have knock-on effects on, let's say, household welfare. I think some of this is driven by what I see as the third implication, and that's just how we're going about gauging and analyzing conflict exposure itself. So first of all, it's a pretty rare event. Some of our analysis of World Bank data in Nigeria, trying to look at poverty trajectories, show that only 5% of households across Nigeria had been exposed to conflict over the last, well, between 2010 and 2016. So that's a pretty small slice. And the approach that we're using in that and a lot of our other instruments is essentially, just a binary. Were you or your household exposed to X, Y, and Z forms of violence or conflict? We think that's insufficient in a number of ways. So we've actually looked at external sources of data. Marco mentioned some to be able to understand objectively where conflict has occurred. But that's also difficult to kind of apply to a geographic area because we really don't know the intensity and the extent to which any individual household might have been affected. And then I guess the other aspect of this is that we don't really capture the indirect effects of conflict so much. So for example, going back to Syria, one of the striking results that came out of our analysis was that 90% of households were expressing fear and insecurity, so more on the kind of psychosocial mental health side. So, fearing for their lives or the lives of their loved ones. And in our qualitative work, it was pretty clear that, this had, equal effects on people's decision-making around their livelihoods and welfare, as did, direct experience of conflict or displacement. And again, it's just one I don't think we pick up on as much as we could. And as a result, we may be getting results that are counterintuitive. So implication-wise, I guess I see for the research community, two tracks that we really need to pursue. One in my mind is this quite sophisticated quantitative approaches towards trying to predict conflict and potentially other shocks and then try to attribute change to those. And then on the other side, as I think Joanna mentioned in your work and Tim and others, really trying to unpack more qualitatively, in this case, how people are experiencing conflict, how they're responding, so that we can actually have instruments that are a bit more in touch with the realities. And then for the program side, to me, it really is just a need to kind of be honest and push back on this idea that we can and should build resilience to the effects of conflict. And there, again, I think if we look a little bit more towards the peace-building field especially, there's a lot of experience to draw on, both programmatically as well as from a measurement perspective. Thanks.
And last but not least, Erwin.
Hi everyone, my name is Erwin Knippenberg. I'm a recently graduated PhD student from Cornell University, and therefore I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you briefly, try to do in 7 minutes, talk to you about my entire thesis, so wish me luck with that. I was told I wasn't allowed to use equations, so this is going to be interesting. I want to talk a little bit about a project that's been mentioned a couple of times today, MIRA, Measuring Indicators for Resilience Analysis. RIMA was taken, IRMA is still to be taken, so for the next resilience project. It's a project where we use high-frequency data to quantify resilience in Malawi specifically. I should note that when I say high-frequency data, people who work on Wall Street laugh at me because for them high frequency means nanoseconds. For us, this means months, but then I explain to them, no. In development, a month is a nanosecond. So, getting something turned around in a month is quite an achievement in development. So with that in mind, yes, I do this myself. With that in mind, I'm going to jump right into this region in Malawi, the Shire River Basin, which is often hit by shocks. Here you have an illustration of the flood zone of the Shire River. That's the red. And you can imagine that places that are in the flood zone are more likely to be hit by floods, but less likely to be hit by drought. So we went ahead in this environment that was very prone to shocks and sampled a set of households that were both in the flood zone and outside that flood zone. So we had a stratified sample. And then what we wanted to do was we had embedded enumerators in these villages, in these communities, collecting data on a monthly basis in terms of what these households were experiencing in terms of shocks and what the outcomes were in terms of their food security indicators. And we've been doing this for coming on to 2 years now with the collaboration of Catholic Relief Services, who some people are in the room, and thank you to them for all their help. And I'm going to share with you some of the insights that this somewhat novel data collection method has delivered to us. Speaking a little bit to what Joanna pointed out in terms of the different things you can do with resilience analysis, we're going to talk a little bit about the insights it can deliver in terms of what characteristics drive resilience, and we're going to talk about how it can be used to make predictions for the future. So let's start first with the insights. We tracked a total of 14 different shocks. Here we're highlighting the 4 most frequent ones. And first notice that we see a lot of seasonal variation. What the dotted line expresses is what we would have extrapolated if we only had a baseline end line, your traditional panel, and then you see the actual fluctuation in shocks over time. Notice first that if we only had a baseline end line, we would have severely underestimated the incidence of reported drought. Again, speaking to a theme that has come up again and again here, we really wanted to collect subjective impressions of these shocks because we wanted to capture how people were perceiving these shocks rather than how these shocks were being experienced objectively using satellite data. So this is already telling us that in a traditional data collection model, we're severely underreporting certain shocks. We also see the seasonality of certain shocks such as crop disease, which we understand was due to a spike and a surge in the incidence of fall armyworm right around the harvest season. So really we're getting a lot more richness out of the data just by plotting these shocks on a month-by-month basis. The next step we wanted to do is actually try and quantify this in terms of resilience. What do we mean by resilience? Well, we wanted to look specifically at the persistence of these shocks over time. Conditional on experiencing a shock in the previous month, what's your probability of still experiencing that shock in the next month? What's its persistence? And you can think of resilience as the anti-persistence. So if the shock is non-persistent, then the household is resilient. With that in mind, we calculated the persistence of these shocks for every household in every month, and then ran it against a number of household characteristics. I should emphasize this is not an RCT, this is not causal, this is simply observational, but the insights it leads us to are revealing. Notably, being located in the floodplain, unsurprisingly, makes you less susceptible, makes drought less persistent, so you're more resilient to drought, but it makes illness more persistent, which makes sense when we think of floodplains being where diseases like malaria and cholera tend to be more endemic. More interestingly, and I guess this will count as my one insight, my deliverable for the day, is secondary house. Now that sounds weird, right? You think of secondary house, you think of that house in the Hamptons. Well, actually, in Malawi, secondary house is a shack that households have far from home where they overnight because they have fields that require them to travel. So what this indicator is actually telling us is these households have fields far from where they live, sufficiently far that they have to travel. So really, the fact that these households are more resilient to drought tells us that spatial diversity, so this diversification of livelihoods in terms of where your fields are, is a big component to help reduce the impact of drought. And we, in fact, in a subsequent paper with the World Bank, we explore that narrative further in Ethiopia and find that indeed land fragmentation improves household resilience and mitigates the effects of drought. Finally, I'll note two other indicators that might be of interest. The household head being female, you're less resilient to illness, and a household member being chronically ill, you're also less resilient to illness. Because these were neighbors asking neighbors, we didn't explicitly ask about HIV, but it was understood that a lot of people reporting chronically ill were infected with HIV. So these are a lot of these insights that can be generated through this sort of analysis. So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and pitch you so that was sort of the insights on an inferential perspective. Here are the insights in terms of predicting the future. So we can use the same data and run some machine learning algorithms through it to predict both within sample in the future and out of sample what the food insecurities outcomes are going to be in the future. And what you see here is on your right, the actual outcomes that we observed in these months, and then the other two are the outcomes as reported by our algorithms. And you'll see they're pretty similar. So what does this mean? This means, first of all, notice the huge spatial variety. Some places that are literally adjacent to one another are experiencing very different outcomes in terms of food security, which speaks to how different communities deal with shocks differently. But this is also an important policy tool because we can hand this to local government, to NGOs and so forth, and help them specifically target the places that are most in need of assistance. Finally, this tool has come in handy quite recently with the outbreak of fall armyworm, which is a pest that has been devastating corn crops in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been harnessing this tool to specifically track fall armyworm, and this is an illustration of how we can actually map fall armyworm on a district-by-district basis in Malawi. So just another kind of illustration of how this resilience-oriented data can really help you address a panoply of shocks, even the ones you didn't necessarily expect coming in. And I'll end with this picture, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, and we were actually discussing during lunch, is how does the community, how do the households benefit from all this data collection? You know, we're going in, we're asking them all these questions, we're taking up their time. So something we really wanted to do was give the data back in some form. So we developed a user-friendly dashboard, just a color-coded spreadsheet that told them what shocks were occurring in their villages and what to expect. And we went back to the villages and we handed it to them and we talked them through it. And what we found was people were very receptive, both because it confirmed what they had already, sometimes it confirmed what they already knew, but it gave them a powerful advocacy tool. It gave them something tangible to demonstrate to local authorities, to other communities, listen, this is what we're going through, this is what we're experiencing it, and here's the evidence. And this proved a crucial element in ensuring the communities continue to work and collaborate with us moving forward. And so with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you to all the panelists. I just want to extract some kind of high-level take-homes from each of the panelists' presentations. So from Tim's presentation, I think one of the biggest take-homes is that in the midst of an extreme event, so he talked about dynamics in the context of a 50-year drought, sometimes maintenance is progress, right? Even if that maintenance of your food security level is low, maintenance as opposed to a severe decline was the result, right? That was the definition of progress in that particular context and with that particular shock in mind, that particular shock event. Marco talked a lot about using existing data, so I just wanted to highlight the fact that the resilience measurement principles that we've talked about today can be used to drive primary data collection, but need not only be used in conjunction with primary data collection. If you have data, you can apply these measurement principles, and then we all know of multiple data sets that we all kind of work with on a regular basis. These measurement principles can be applied. Marco also talked about subjective understanding how households are making meaning themselves, which drives decision-making and behaviors. Lynn kind of echoed that. I think one of the biggest take-homes from Lynn's presentation was that the communities that we're working with are operating in a historical context, and that context doesn't go away, even though some of those dynamics go away. So conflict and the effects of different trauma-inducing situations remain even when those events have passed, and so we need to take that into consideration. They're not operating in a bubble. John kind of reinforced this notion of resilience capacities versus the efficacy of those capacities. So just because you have certain strategies at your disposal, or certain resources, they may not always be effective at managing those shocks and stresses. It's why, from a measurement perspective, only measuring resilience capacities doesn't really suffice in terms of whether you're actually capturing resilience. You want to know how those resilience capacities function in the face of a shock or stress, and what effects they have on well-being over time. And lastly, Erwin's presentation reinforced this notion that we've heard all day around the benefits of panel data, the richness of high-frequency data collections. And then I also wanted to just echo that although the evolution of resilience in development has been focused on drought, it need not be focused on drought moving forward. And he highlighted a really great example of applying it to pest invasion shocks. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from our BIFAD members. Are there any questions or reflections? And then, yes, Pamela.
John. Thank you all. That was great. But I have a question about conflict. So part of what when I was listening to you, it's like we all think of conflict as a shock, and then you're asking which livelihood assets is this impacting on, and what does that mean in terms of potential negative outcomes. Then you started talking about Syria. And Syria just feels to me like that is off the charts. You're talking about destruction of the livelihood and possible displacement. So the question is, do you need, is anybody working on a typology of conflict, and which types of conflict would we be dealing with in this kind of resilience framework, and what kinds of conflicts might have to be dealt with in a more traditional emergency humanitarian response?
You want to take several?
Why don't you answer that question then?
Okay. Thank you. Yes. So up to now, I think we've been reasonably successful at trying to look at and to some extent address resilience in more intercommunal conflict, so typically what you see in the Horn, in the Sahel. Less so for sure in sort of urban violence, gang situations in the Americas. I don't think it's been really looked at there. And then in a place like Syria, the sort of state-sponsored political violence, I mean, it's certainly one where we have honest questions of whether that kind of a lens is appropriate. And even language-wise, we tend to stay away from resilience because it does have this connotation of, okay, good luck with that. So what we have come out with understanding is there may not be a way to change resilience there, but we can understand that it is something that exists, and we can look for entry points with our recovery programming, whether that is going in and strengthening women's roles in the public sector, or other things that we see kind of explaining some of the inherent resilience or recovery in the population. And I think it's a very healthy thing, and in terms of a topology, we and others are trying to kind of come out with what are sort of prerequisites within the spectrum of conflict and violence where you can even kind of start thinking about a resilience approach. Thanks.
Yes, okay, so why don't we take two or three more from the room and then.
Okay, a general kind of question on history and context again. And you just wanted some general comments on, it seems to me that the nature of the analysis of various types of resilience, of various types of shocks and conflicts, helps place responsibility to different types of donors, whether it's community level, state level, macroeconomic relationships among nations, or with the African Union or ASEAN or European Union. And the nature of the analysis could be used to help shape that. And it was that general kind of concept that I wanted any comments you had on.
Are there any other?
Yes, I just have a question. I know Jacob Watson with World Vision. So I know Erwin and John kind of mentioned machine learning and looking at systems-based modeling, and maybe the other panelists also have some experience, but I was just wondering how you see that affecting application and implementation in actual projects, and is machine learning at a position where it should be affecting implementation?
Hi, Andrea Lozano from DAI. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is for Erwin from Cornell. I found it really interesting, the graph that you presented about the different assets and how they were correlated with a different type of shock or stressor. But it seemed like, I don't know if I was reading that graph correctly, it seemed like some of those assets had negative impact for some type of stresses or shocks, and positive impacts with others. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about what could explain that. And the other question is around, most of these models I feel have a focus on understanding the assets that households can rely on to cope with stress. But it's very much focused on physical assets, right? And I'm reflecting on Lynn's presentation about psychosocial ability, and I just wonder if that's something that's coming. When are we going to see more interest and measurement on those factors to incorporate in these models? Thank you. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take this set and then open it back up to online, and then also other folks in the room. So I think the first reflection was on leveraging different analyses or different analytic approaches for different donors and or stakeholders. Is that right? So I'll start, and then maybe other folks, I'm thinking Marco might want to chime in. But I'll just start with a general comment that, the interest in applying evidence-driven learnings around resilience to programming and policy is very high. The feedback that we're constantly getting, particularly from host government stakeholders, is that this is not a dissertation, right? Like, we don't have time or energy to get a dissertation in resilience measurement to figure out how to make our countries and communities more resilient. So that doesn't mean that the analytic approaches need to necessarily be changed, because the concept is complex. The translation of the analytic approaches for usability, I think, needs to be addressed. And so I know it's something that we're very mindful of. I know FAO works very closely with host governments. I think the tendency is to say, this is complex, just give us an indicator, right? Like, why can't we just track something over time? And so that dance between, it really is worth it to get this wealth of information and to apply it to programming and policy. There needs to be some kind of intermediary to translate between kind of the rigor and the application. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to speak to that question.
Can I?
Yes, Michael.
Yeah, I think it's a very good observation, a very good comment, honestly, and it takes me to the reflection about how we need to keep the tool as simple as possible and as flexible as possible, because the largest part of the time I face reactions which are like, nice. Then What's the added value of this and things like this? No? So we need to keep it simple. We need to keep it flexible. We work with the largest part of the regional initiative that you were mentioning. I'm just back from a training with the African Union. We're using RIMA for following the Malabo Declaration. So think about, we have to adapt our RIMA, which is a household level and to a new context. But at the same time, I think that's no other way around. That's our job. That's why we are here. I mean, no? So they are more right than we are. So we need to adapt and to keep it simple and flexible as much as possible.
Okay, and I know Tim wanted to speak to that question as well.
I think that most of our understanding is that when people are faced with shocks and stresses, 95 or 90% of the response is local. In other words, it's households and communities dealing with it. It's only when the shock is so great that it overwhelms an area that you start to have other types of social protection that are brought in. And one of the things that I think is really important when you think about resilience is that it's not the absence of social protection that's important here. It's understanding when social protection needs to be brought in a timely fashion, at how long, and at what intensity, so that we are enabling people to maintain their assets so they can get back on their feet as soon as possible. But most of the time, these shocks are not large covariant shocks. They tend to be more localized, and people are dealing with them on their own. You know, it's very rare that a CNN moment happens where you're going to have it large enough that it gets everybody else's attention. And what we're trying to do in programming is have our measurement enable people that are implementing these programs, whether that be government or whether that be NGOs or UN organizations, enabling them to know whether or not what they're investing in is making a difference in allowing local people to be able to manage these things more effectively. And so that's what drives us in trying to get the measurement right. Now, it's great to get these publications out, too, to convince people, you know, in our field that they should be concerned about these things. But our first objective is to try to make sure that the programming is done right, that it has the right effect, so that the resources that are being invested by the U.S. government or by other donors are done in an effective manner. And that's also why we're interested in trying to understand the value addition of our efforts as well. We're trying to see what is the value added of taking this approach versus another approach in trying to bring about the kind of impact that we're hoping for. So you'll see a lot more cost-benefit analysis being brought into the way we think about this stuff, trying to understand, you know, what is the value for money that with relationship to these investments.
All right, so can I ask Erwin to speak to the specific question around some of the findings, and then I don't know if you also want to speak to the machine learning question?
I think John and I will both tackle the machine learning
one. Okay,
one.
great, thanks.
But yeah, so that's an excellent question. That's kind of the interest of doing a shock-by-shock analysis as opposed to... Erwin. Sorry, is this better? Okay. No, it's a fantastic question, and it's one of the interests of doing a shock-by-shock analysis, and I think it's a point that's been raised in the theory panel and should be reiterated. Resilience should really be caveated by resilience to what? And being resilient to a certain shock doesn't ensure you're resilient to other shocks. Specifically speaking to our results, a lot of these are null results. You'll see with the error bars you're quite close to zero, but I think the one where you do see contrasting effects depending on the shocks is the floodplain. And I spoke briefly to that during my presentation, but there is this story where if you're in the floodplain, the soil is more moist, it's less likely to dry up during the dry season or during low rainfall, so you're more resilient to drought, but you're also exposed to more pathogens like mosquitoes that carry malaria, diarrhea, cholera, and so forth, so you're less resilient to illness. You can also dive into, they're not quite significant, but notice the contrast. When the household head is female, they are less resilient to sickness, but surprisingly almost more resilient to drought and flood. We think this is partially because these are often widowed households who don't farm themselves, so they're just less likely to be adversely affected by a drought or flood. But again, I think that's kind of the advantage of this shock-by-shock analysis. And just to chime in on the earlier point, I'm in no way saying this is the only way to look at it. In fact, in my thesis, having written a dissertation on this, I find there's a lot to gain from doing comparative approaches and looking at the different insights that comparative approaches will lead you to. I guess I'll also tackle the machine learning, or attempt to tackle the machine learning one. I think the first question you should always ask yourself when you want to do machine learning is, can I do this with OLS? And that should be your baseline. I was actually at a conference last month in San Francisco where a lot of people were presenting these really beautiful, fancy tools, some really, really exciting stuff, some really cutting-edge stuff. But the question always came back to, so how is this useful to the policymaker? You know, this was being held by the World Bank, co-hosted by the World Bank, and the question was, how can the World Bank use this? And for me, it really comes down to two things. One is forecasting. So can you actually use the data we're collecting, because on-the-ground data is expensive to collect and hard to collect. Can you then extrapolate away from that? And I know David Lobel and Marshall Burke at Stanford and others are doing a lot of really great work on this sort of extrapolation. And the other area that I'm quite excited about is image recognition. So when you're concerned about data quality issues, you can go into image recognition and use that and train your algorithms on that to determine, well, is this really fall armyworm? Is this particular landscape under drought conditions? And essentially, especially as smartphones become more and more ubiquitous and you can ask people to take pictures of their surroundings, there's a large scope for then analyzing that data and using that to answer some of these questions more objectively.
And just briefly on the application side, for us on the NGO side, we've seen machine learning be most useful just in terms of operational decision making so far. So for example, back in Syria, we've got a partnership where we're able to help make decisions around pre-positioning by trying to predict both displacement as well as conflict, changing checkpoints, and so it's really helped the ops team be able to figure out, again, when and where to move in with supplies.
Okay, and then lastly, there was a question around assets being conceived more broadly than physical assets. Does anyone want to? Yes, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we were only given we can only present one data point, basically. So in the work that we do, we have a whole suite of psychosocial factors that we are looking at. We're very interested in aspirations. We're interested in social capital. We're interested in competence to adapt. We're interested in people's perceptions of whether they think they can recover. So we use a lot of different kind of intangibles that we're measuring, not just physical assets, because we have found that those factors are really important in actually contributing to people's resilience. That if they feel confident to adapt, if they feel that they have higher aspirations, they're more likely to try some new things that are going to make them able to adapt better to these circumstances. So we find it's an area that we want to do a lot more work in, and in fact, one of the studies that we would like to do with Mercy Corps in the future is look at subjective measures and compare them to more objective measures to see if they predict the same things in multiple locations.
Okay, are there any questions online? And then we'll come back to the room. I just want to give our online colleagues an opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you. We have two that are appropriate for right now, and then several others we'll save for the 4 o'clock session. The first one is, can the presentation slides be made available? And this is from Chioma Nakwana, senior lecturer at University of Agriculture in Nigeria. I'll answer that one. And the answer is, the approach we take is we ask the presenter, they say yes or no, and most all of them say yes. We post those on links. You can find a link to that on the usaid.gov/BIFAD website. I will add to that this video, live stream video, is being recorded. That recording goes up, and so, for instance, in 2 weeks, for all of you people in the audience who are follicularly challenged around your chin and you want to remember John Kurtz's joke really well, you can go back and re-listen to his joke about that panel. This is the second question is from Global Climate Advisor from the UK. And he said, and this was really targeted to Dr. Mubarak, but I think it refers to this panel also. You refer to randomized controlled trials as a gold standard, yet the most resilience practitioners find non-experimental, theory-based design is more useful in revealing the quantitative and qualitative complexities of resilience. Don't you see the importance of avoiding measuring approaches that may work well for a single cause and affect relationships, but work less well in the real world? I'd like any of the panel to talk about that.
Okay,
Thanks.
can you give us a sense of how we are on time as well?
We're 7 minutes over.
We also started 7 minutes late, so I didn't know if we got any extra time. Does anyone want to speak to the applicability of RCTs and the context that we worked?
You want to? Go ahead.
I can.
Okay.
RCT are golden standard, and we all agree on this. RCT are quite rare, and especially when it is up to the issue of an impact assessment. So if I am, even when I am discussing together with the project designer, it's very hard to convey the message that we need to have a randomization. It's extremely complicated. So I can't agree more on the fact that we need to have a tool which is flexible again and adaptable to the situation. In our case, we managed to, but not only in our case, now it's a common practice, I think, more or less, with all the practitioners adapting to using pseudo-panel approach, to use different solutions, a randomized phase-in, which is a decent solution. No? So you're not completely randomizing the implementation of the project. So you're not selecting in a random way the beneficiaries, but you're randomly selecting the areas of the project where you're entering, so that you can have like a phase-in approach. That's the reality. Otherwise, we remain in our golden world. I mean, so yeah, absolutely, I can't agree more with this person.
I think one of the problems that we find is that when you do have these multi-sector, very complex programs, like the PRIME project, for example, it's very difficult to do an RTC. And so what we try to do is we use quasi-experimental designs for this purpose, and we find that is very effective. It's very hard to do an RTC with such a complex type of programming effort. So I think that there's room for all of these things. I think one of the things that we don't want to say only do this and don't do that. I think what we want to do is have opportunities to do both, and then learn from those when we do them.
Thank you. So I just would like to thank all of the panelists. As you've heard, analytic capacity is definitely in need. But when the resilience measurement principles that we've talked about today are applied, the learning is robust, right? It's nuanced and it's actionable, very importantly. We believe that the capacity to do these types of analyses actually is present. It's in American universities. So I know in the next panel after the break, we'll be talking about some ways to harness that capacity that's latent in American universities. I did ask the panelists to brainstorm some potential ways to harness that capacity, that technical analytic capacity, and they thought of things like perhaps a resilience measurement innovation lab, fellowship programs and dissertation grants, and training on how to make actual programming and policy implications. So in addition to the rigorous research training, training graduate students on how to draw out the implications of that work. So with that, I think we're taking a break, and thank you for listening to our panel.